we have the original Marvel Universe's Hulk vs. Abomination, which somehow manages to be even more of a complete victory than the Ultimate versions. After Abomination was blamed for the death of Bruce Banner's wife, Betty Ross, the Hulk went on a complete rampage to destroy Abomination, something the villain intended to finally figure out which of the two green giants was stronger. But in a final humiliating moment, the Hulk had the opportunity to finally kill Abomination, but instead chose to revert back to Bruce Banner, showing his humanity and proving to Abomination that Banner had the strongest willpower of all, the ultimate defeat for Abomination. Coming in at number 4, we have Hulk smashing Loki in the original MCU Avengers film. For years, comic book fans had been yearning to see a proper adaptation of the Jade Giant on screen. And while earlier live-action Hulk films were ambitious in their own ways and had their own unique moments, the most iconic and defining Hulk moment finally came when the Hulk joined the Avengers in their first team-up movie and interrupted Loki's monologuing to give him the beatdown he deserved. This was the Hulk we'd all been waiting to see, and hearing Cap tell him to smash, or the Hulk saying puny god, they were definitely worth the wait.
Which brings us to number 3, when Iron Man totally humiliates this fleet of guys wearing power suits that they think could combat his own. With their suits having the same firepower as some small countries, they expect there's no way Tony Stark could match up against them. In fact, Tony is even wearing his classic armor, which isn't quite as powerful as his updated suit, so they even have a better chance than usual to even the score. And still, they're made to look like fools, as Iron Man easily evades their heat-seeking missiles and diverts them to actually backfire and destroy the armored assailants themselves. It's just an absolute joke watching him face off against these guys, carrying them around like they're action figures and throwing insults at them, and they seem so confident. That's what kills me about this list, is how confident all these villains are before Iron Man shows them who's boss. It just makes the wins all more embarrassing when they come. Okay, nearing the top of our list at number 2, we have the iconic face-off between Iron Man and Captain America. During the Civil War conflict, the Avengers are split into 2 different factions, one side being led by Captain America, the other by Iron Man. And as tensions escalate on either side, it finally culminates to a big battle between the 2 sides, and of course between Iron Man and Captain America themselves. But like everyone else on this list, Captain America somehow underestimates Tony Stark when he tries to pull a fast one on him and disable his armor. After what seems like a conciliatory handshake between Iron Man and Captain America, Tony notices a small electron scrambler device on his hand, leaving him open to a blow by Cap's shield right to the face. But as Iron Man is laying on the ground, petrified, he simply reboots his armor and gets back up. I don't think Captain America expects this either, because Iron Man flies at him and after an effortless fist fight, knocks him to the ground, almost severing his jaw with one massive punch in the face. This is high up on the list because Captain America is a very skilled strategist, and watching him get shown up so hard like this has to be pretty humiliating, especially in front of all his peers like that. Oof. At number 1, it is the face-off that Iron Man has against Magneto during the Avengers vs. X-Men storyline. This event takes the top of the list because of the irony. Get it? Iron-y? The irony of this particular face-off, given that Magneto manipulates metal and Iron Man is made of it. Fans had been anticipating this face-off for some time, so when it came, everyone expected Magneto to take the W. And that includes Magneto himself. But in classic ingenious Iron Man fashion, Tony Stark shows up to the fight with a special non-metal armor made out of nanotubes, stealing this huge advantage from Magneto. But that's not where it ends. Iron Man then harnesses the power of Jupiter's magnetic field to power up his armor and take down the magnetic supervillain. And while Magneto is coming back for one final attempt, he's distracted by Phoenix Force, giving Iron Man the chance to knock him out properly this time. This is a huge embarrassment for Magneto since he's the obvious choice for this battle. It might take some time to recover from that one, and I'm not just talking about his physical wounds.
Number 10, General Koi and Prince Baran get spooked. Wrapping up the events involving Terra Verde's civil unrest and the face-off with Spore in issue number 23 of the original Wolverine series, Wolverine decided upon his return to Madripoor that it was time to give General Koi and Prince Baran a taste of their own medicine. While Prince Baran was a sometimes ally of Wolverine's, for this story he was more playing the role of sometimes villain or antagonist that he's also known for in the series. As such, in the middle of the night, Wolverine pays a visit to both men and kidnaps them. They awaken blindfolded in the sewers, where Wolverine explains the extent of what can happen if the vial of the drug orb that Koi chose to keep were unleashed on someone, how it would basically make them go insane. It could also potentially unleash a darker evil who was only just defeated, Spore. Really not cool for you to keep that vial, Koi. Koi and Baran fear that Wolverine has administered the drug to them, terrified. They discover, however, that this is not the case, and instead that the only threat in these sewers is an equally deadly and very angry Wolverine. Horrified, they run in fear and escape from the sewers, only to be laughed at by the people of Madripoor as they surface, covered in sewage. Hopefully they learn their lesson. Knowing General Koi though, probably not, because then he does a lot of other stuff. Number 9. Unintentionally embarrassed Sabretooth. Sure, Wolverine is all for putting Victor in his place. Once he met the guy and knew how bad he was, that is. But before that, the Creeds were just a family that Wolverine kinda got tied up in. Logan ended up captured and in a circus being used as an attraction. Something about the X-Men and circuses, I tell you, happens a lot. This was really a low point in Wolverine's life as he was suffering from severe depression after the death of Rose, and then following that, the death of his wolf pack by Nathaniel Essex Bear, which was really upsetting because he'd taken a lot of solace in his pack. In the end, it was Clara Creed who managed to reach out to Logan, saving him both physically and emotionally. The two fell in love with one another quickly, but it didn't end well for either of them. Saul Creed, Clara's little brother, sold them out. Once this was revealed, Logan felt the only way to protect Clara was to get rid of Saul, permanently. Clara was ready to cut Saul out of her life, but didn't want to see him killed. Because Logan killed Saul, she rejected him. And because Logan killed Saul, Victor interpreted it as a slight, embarrassed that Logan had been the one to kill Saul, as Saul was Victor's to torment. Victor would visit Saul each year on his birthday to beat him up. So yeah, hence why Sabretooth visits Wolverine each year now instead, because he was like, how dare you do this to me? This is unacceptable. And friends, before we move on to this next spot, if you are loving this list and you want to hear about more times that Wolverine kind of embarrassed his villains intentionally and unintentionally, be sure to let us know by giving this video a thumbs up. Number 8. Blew up Dracula. If you've been surprised by Dracula appearing as a Wolverine villain in his current 2020 series, don't be. These two actually have a lot of history, and the mutants themselves have also tangled with vampires in general in the past. Old Man Logan even faced Dracula before, when mutants were disappearing and he was on the trail of tracking down his good pal and one of his sidekicks back in the day, Jubilee. This time around, however, Dracula seems to be interested in harnessing Wolverine's blood for its healing properties, and using the blood to help all vampires walk in the daylight without danger of going up in flames and perishing. Wolverine, however, literally blew up Dracula's well-laid plans when he took part in a plan to turn his body into a bomb. Well, more a devoid of consciousness clone body. This body was then offered to Dracula by his less than faithful servant Omega Red, which means instead of walking in the daylight, much of Drax's following instead went up in smoke, as Wolverine's clone's blood was altered to be like liquid sunshine to the vamps, thick with photonic cells, and so he became a dirty bomb. Or well, his clone became a dirty bomb.
At number 7, we have the time when Iron Man escapes the black hole created when Godkiller self-destructs. What's embarrassing about this event is that Godkiller's intentions are to take Iron Man with it in the blast created by its own self-destruction, and it's very sure that it'll accomplish this task considering Iron Man is aboard it. Godkiller is basically a giant suit of armor and Iron Man is in it. That's strangely hard to explain, but I think you know what I mean. And I don't blame Godkiller for having high expectations for this final feat, considering the black hole it ends up creating is the size of Earth, meaning that it would have 24 times the mass of the sun. So that means that the only thing Godkiller miscalculates, much like everyone else on this list, is Iron Man's strength, speed, and durability. And yeah, Iron Man comes flying out of the black hole, escaping the close call with his life completely intact. And that means that Godkiller obliterates himself basically for nothing, allowing Iron Man to escape to safety, despite the pull of 24 suns on his back. Godkiller gets absolutely owned here, but at least he's not alone. He's got the other 9 villains on this list to talk it out with. At number 6 is the time when Iron Man unhinges a plan set by the Raxxon Corporation when they detonate a deposit of vibranium to try and destroy a fleet of battleships. Basically, going back, it starts with a battle between Iron Man and Namor, which is interrupted by the realization that Raxxon is trying to gain control of a whole island due to a deposit of the highly valuable metal vibranium mentioned earlier. When a group of battleships close in to prevent this from taking place, the corrupt corporation decides to detonate the vibranium so that no one can have it. And it seems to be part of the plan to destroy these battleships in the process. But what does Iron Man do? He decides he wants to control the narrative and physically tows the 5 battleships away from the explosion. This makes it so Raxxon just destroys the vibranium for no reason. And Iron Man does this with one of his old armors too. He can't help but show everyone that he he has the strength to change everyone's plan at any given time and leave them in the dust wondering what happened. Okay, at number 4 is the time when Iron Man fractures the Phoenix Force with his Phoenix Buster armor. Now, I'm not sure if the Phoenix Force can physically feel anything, let alone embarrassment, considering it's a cosmic entity powerful enough to shatter whole worlds like glass, but if it could, its face would be red and hot after Iron Man absolutely wrecks Phoenix Force, forcing it to split up into 5 pieces. And the Phoenix Force isn't the only one who should be feeling the burn from this huge win by Iron Man. Thor even fails to take down Phoenix Force with his hammer right before Tony succeeds at it. So Iron Man is just showing everyone up in this event. And this is a huge event that had been building up for a while. Phoenix Force had been posing a huge threat to the X-Men and the Avengers in this storyline. So Iron Man just showing up and blowing it up into a bunch of pieces is pretty humiliating for such a powerful being. I just like to picture Phoenix Force getting all geared up about taking out all these superheroes and then their plans having to change entirely after a little human in his own little armor appears to stop them in their tracks. It's just, yikes, wrecked.
Number 3, Omega Red versus the Wolverines. You mess with the Wolverine, you get a bunch of them that you have to deal with. You get all the Wolverines. As was evident when Omega Red came to Krakoa seeking to claim what his mutant given right was, to take refuge on the new mutant island nation. And, you know, not be condemned or anything, even though he did bad stuff in the past. However, not everyone was able to forgive and forget when it came to his past, namely Wolverine. Still suspicious of Omega Red, once it seemed as though he'd seen him appear outside of Krakoa and kind of trap him in ice, Wolverine was ready to confront him, already having an uneasy feeling about his former nemesis since pretty much day 1. However, when Wolverine explained what had happened to him, to his family, they weren't ready to let him go in alone. He was joined by Daken and Gabby, who both showed Omega Red how easy it was to sneak up on him and get him in a trap. In the end, the discussion had to be tabled, but it was pretty fun to see the look on his face when the Wolverine family came together to attack him. If you were wondering where Laura was, by the way, she'd likely still be in the vault at this time, as per her adventures in the 2019 X-Men series, which is why she wasn't there. Otherwise, I'm sure Laura would also be there. Number 2, found the perfect match for Solemn. After it was revealed that Solemn had taken Logan's Muramasa blade and ended up giving one such blade to the Iraqi pirate, Severe, during Solemn's escape from him, Wolverine tracked Solemn down. He confronted Solemn and was convinced to take on Sever with him together. Later, Solemn bailed on this confrontation in typical Solemn fashion, it seems. However, Wolverine had a few tricks up his sleeve. Realizing that he and Solemn were fairly even matched, he decided to call in some reinforcements. Wolverine went to the White Queen, Emma Frost, and had her join him in their confrontation of Solemn, which she was happy to do as she had her own score to settle with him. They pursued Solemn to the sliver of remaining Araco Island on Earth where he was hiding out. And let's just say that while Wolverine and Solemn could likely fight against one another all day to only really reach a stalemate, Emma was out of Solemn's league. She interrogated him, much to his dismay and embarrassment, because Emma of course can easily access almost anyone's hidden dirty secrets and desires, no matter how dirty and secret and hidden they are. So now she knows everything about Solemn, whether she wanted to or not. Number 1, Ultimate Family Jewels. Oh boy. Of course, a lot of embarrassing moments would come from the Ultimate Universe, wouldn't they? This one hails from issue number 12 of the Ultimate X-Men series. Here, Ultimate Wolverine and Ultimate Sabretooth face off, only for Wolverine to completely embarrass Victor in this fight. As Sabretooth holds Wolverine beneath the water, making him suffocate and killing his brain cells, Wolverine counterattacks by going for his, family jewels, as he calls them. His retort to Sabretooth mocking how he'll never be considered a brainiac now turns to tears and pain as Wolverine responds that at least he's smart enough to cover his family jewels in a fight. Number 2, Possessed by Chthon. This is one of those times that Wanda was made a villain truly without any of her own intent steering her there. Wanda was actually marked by Chthon at birth to act as the Elder God's vessel, should he find a way to return. Chthon would actually succeed in possessing Wanda and using her to return on more than one occasion, though the first time around was probably the worst, when Mordred summoned Chthon via a ritual, allowing the god to basically take hold of Wanda and leaving the Avengers powerless against his will. Fortunately, the disaster that would be Chthon's return was averted before the ritual could be fully completed. Thank goodness for dolls with parts of Wanda's soul in them. That's what happened. Number 1, losing her children. If you were to ask Wanda what one of the worst things that ever happened to her was, I'm sure she would likely answer the loss of her children. Although she would get her 2 twin boys, Billy and Tommy, back when their souls were basically reborn into our world, reincarnating them, she would never really get back the family that she had initially willed into existence. Using her power and from her desire, Wanda made it possible for her and Vision to have children together, and Wanda gave birth to 2 twin boys. However, when others learned that they weren't real and that their existence was kind of making reality unstable, they forced Scarlet Witch to confront the truth, temporarily destroying or displacing her children. Since they weren't really fully destroyed, because they kind of did come back, but just in a really weird comic book way.
Number 10, a healthy diet. What makes a deadly space goop even more terrifying? Well, let's start with its choice of meal. Us. He likes to eat us and our brains. In The Amazing Spider-Man issue 333, Venom said to Spider-Man, "We want to eat your brain." Now, him just saying that to you must be intimidating enough, let alone actually doing it, which we see in Venom the Hunger issue 1. He even surprises himself too when it goes from just being a threat to an actual thing that happens. The symbiote needs to feast on brains, not just because it's yummy and fun, but because of a certain chemical found in the brain instead. Eddie isn't a big fan of this throughout the comics and often prevents it from happening by giving Venom chocolate instead. In my opinion, that's a really good solution. Offer anybody chocolate instead of anything, they'll probably take it. Because chocolate contained the same chemical, so it worked. It was a nice tasty substitute. Until eventually writers just stopped including the need for human brains for a meal altogether, which is great. Let's just do more of that, less eating brains. And before we head over to number 9, if you guys could go ahead and give us a thumbs up down below, that would be great. You guys are the best. Thank you so much for watching. Now back to our list. Number 9, pushed Peter Parker. Now when I say he pushed Peter Parker, you might be thinking, okay, well, so what? This guy does backflips off the Empire State Building for fun. So what's a push really gonna do to this guy? Well, this was an issue because Peter Parker's spider sense didn't go off, which he found troubling. It should have went off. It's danger. Why didn't they tell him? Now, do keep in mind, this is before Venom made his big comic book debut in Amazing Spider-Man 300, so his ability to block his spider sense was still a mystery. So Peter luckily saved himself with his reflexes and Good Samaritans to help him out off the tracks, but Venom was trying to get rid of Peter long before he was slurping up bad guy brains. Now, the fact that he didn't say anything catchy or announce this big plan, any villain monologue, makes it more realistic and pretty scary. Number 8, Mary Jane trauma. Back in his first comic book appearance in 1988, one of the first things Venom did was introduce himself to Mary Jane in the next issue. In this moment, she can't even remember her name. She knows almost nothing because her mind has been harshly numbed while she's cruelly drowned in this onrushing tide of primal fear. That's what the comic says. That's how they described it. And these emotions may never fully fade away. And it's all thanks to Venom. She's so beyond scared that when Peter walks in with the black suit on, she thinks that it's Venom for a brief second. Venom even says that although it wasn't their target, shaking her up could still work. Yeah, for sure. Let's just terrify some people and ruin their lives just because. Awesome. Therapy not included.
Number 7, transformed Carly Cooper. And not in a good way. While under the mantle of Goblin King, Norman sought information from Carly on the true identity of Superior Spider-Man. He had her kidnapped, and when she refused to give up the information, she refused. He decided to recruit her into his Goblin army. Exposing her to the Goblin formula, he turned Carly into one of his own deranged minions, and for a time she served him under the mantle of Monster. She would eventually be returned to her former self, but this experience would leave its mark, changing Carly forever. Immediately after her recovery, she also cut Peter Parker and Spider-Man out of her life and moved from New York to New Orleans. Though she would come back. She would get over it, but it was still pretty terrible. Number 6, drove Harry insane. I mean, I don't think we can blame Norman for all of Harry's villainous actions, but we can definitely blame him, I think, for most of them. As of late, Harry has resurfaced as the villain known as Kindred, twisted into some combination of Harry's soul combined with that of a demon. This even darker version of Harry blames both Peter and his father for everything that went wrong in his life, and comes back to hold them both accountable and make them hey. I guess you could also look at it in the way that Norman and Peter share the blame here for Harry's psyche cracking. As in loving both of them and then discovering their true identities, it created great conflict in him, causing him to turn on Spider-Man and later also to resent his father and his role as Green Goblin. And kind of his legacy, really, because he also, kind of gets that crazy from his dad, just saying. Number 5, tried to make Spider-Man his heir. If you can't beat him, make them join you. Mwahaha! That was Norman's thinking in the Revenge of the Green Goblin story anyways. Here, Norman attempts to brainwash Peter Parker into giving in to his dark side and joining the Green Goblin legacy. I guess I should say his green side. Of course, Norman didn't succeed in the end, but for a moment there, it almost seemed like he might. He also put Peter through hell during this whole endeavor, so regardless of whether or not his plan was successful, it was still pretty awful for Peter the whole time. Number 4, killed JJ. That's right, while in main continuity, JJ would end up being blackmailed by Norman Osborn, in the Ultimate Universe, he would end up being murdered by him. I know, so crazy, especially considering that Jameson thought he had actually shot Norman dead and was in the middle of panicking over the fact. Norman, however, surprised him by getting up and transforming into his goblin self, revealing that in this universe, he was Immortal Green Goblin. Yep, before we had the Immortal Hulk series, we had this. Number 3, director of Hammer. During Dark Reign, we see Norman Osborn basically become the head of what ends up being the S.H.I.E.L.D. replacement. Due to the fact that he eliminated the Skrull Queen, he gets to take over and creates his own agency called Hammer, an acronym that doesn't initially stand for, well, anything actually. It was just picked because Osborn thought it was cool. As the director of Hammer, Osborn also took it upon himself to put together his own Avenger team, with him as the leader, Iron Patriot. Being a villain himself, you can guess what kind of people he called on to assemble his Avengers team. More villains, and some really confused and tormented heroes like Sentry. This was a really dark time in Marvel's history as Norman Osborn used all this power to do all sorts of awful stuff, all under the guise or in the often false name of heroic reasoning. Number 2, killed Gwen Stacy. We all know this one to be one of the worst things that Norman as the Green Goblin has done, so I don't think it's a surprise that this one is high up on our list. One of the worst, not just from Peter's perspective, by the way, but also from fans' perspectives. Many still believe that Gwen was actually the one destined to be with Peter, and in fact, that she would be a better match for him than Mary Jane herself. I personally love MJ and Peter together, and I like to think of Gwen's death as a what if that can only really ever theoretically be answered if she lived. Still, even just from Spider-Man's perspective, this has to be one of the most dastardly deeds his foe has ever committed, as Peter Parker for years has also still blamed himself for Gwen's demise, making this wound just that much more tender, that much more deep. This Green Goblin did it, but then Peter still blamed himself. Rough. Number 1, had children with Gwen Stacy. It was really hard for me to try and reason which of these last few points was really the worst, because they're all really bad, especially these last two. Killing Gwen or having children with her. Which one is worse? In the end, however, considering that he later kills her, I figured this one took the cake. Yep, as if Norman Osborn wasn't diabolical and creepy enough in the comics, we had to retcon in something even more nauseating for him. Enter Sin's past. Here it's retconned in that Norman and Gwen slept together, and as if that wasn't bad enough, he got her pregnant. She gave birth to twins in secrecy in Europe who would be raised by Norman to think that Spider-Man was their father, and that it was he who had killed their mother. I'm not sure if it gets any worse than that, but if it does, I don't think I want to find out how it gets worse.
Coming at number 10, we have Shocker. I think back when this villain was created, the idea of having someone who had vibrations as their superpower would have been a little bit harder to make fun of. Now, many of you probably know Shocker. He has had a few moments in the sun, popping up in video games, and he even has a moment as one of the henchmen of the Vulture. Now you think someone who is canon in the MCU wouldn't fit onto this list, but when we break him down, we start to learn that Shocker isn't that shocking. It would seem that this villain has a knack for losing to Spider-Man every single time, and it's probably because his powers aren't that impressive. He can make shockwaves that blast through the air, and he can make vibration shields. Yeah, I'm not that impressed by what you have to offer. In recent years, we have seen less and less of this punchline of a villain, as I think the writers have seen that his time has come and he will soon be put to bed. As a kid, I always got him and Electro mixed up because I thought Shocker meant that he was electrocuting people because he was shocking them. Well, at least for the new generation, you won't have those problems because this guy is going to be gone pretty soon. Coming at number 9, we have White Rabbit. I mean, right when we start breaking down this villain, you will learn why she is on this list. It's one thing to be a down and out loser who's had enough of the cruel world and now wants to dive into a world of crime because everything else has let them down. But when you come from a rich family and you turn to crime just for the sake of being angsty, then I don't really have much compassion for you, and your character isn't really relatable. The White Rabbit, also known as Lorena Dodson, built her persona off the Alice in Wonderland book. She thought that would be a cool and edgy way to get into the world of crime. I think she just indulged in too many psychedelics and maybe went off the deep end. I wouldn't be surprised if this character was inspired by the rise of LSD in the 80s when this character was birthed. In terms of powers, she has zero. All she has is a bad attitude and a general understanding of martial arts. She's not a villain that any of us are clamoring for. Coming in at number 8, we have Mindworm. You know, for some of these villains, it seems that the writers went to so much work to really come up with someone who was interesting and had motivations for evil, but then they just throw them in the toilet, and that's what really happens with Mindworm. Mindworm starts off great. He has powers from birth. He's some sort of mutant kid with a huge head. Of course, he's weird and kids don't like him, but at least his parents love his huge cranium. But what Mindworm doesn't know is that he's feeding off the psionic energy of his parents, draining their brain. Eventually, he gets too greedy with this and he kills his own mother and father. He didn't mean to do this. He was just a young mutant kid who didn't know any better, and now he was an orphan. From there, he was bullied in the orphanage and he learns how to use his powers. Eventually, he grows up and is living in a New York apartment where he's feeding off all the people in the building and getting pretty strong off this. But Spider-Man moves in and he senses that someone's trying to suck out his brain energy. The two have a clash and Mindworm is killed by some gang members. Like, all of that work into building up who this guy is, and he was gone just like that. What a waste.
Number 7. Broke Black Cat's nose and heart. Venom wanted everything to do with Spider-Man. He wanted to take away everything, starting of course with his love life. So in Amazing Spider-Man 3:16, he goes after another close acquaintance. This time it's Black Cat. We see her in a train of thought, wondering where Spider-Man had moved to. How peculiar indeed, I wonder. So she's come to realize that her and the Spider should be together, and then now Venom comes in just to ruin her entire day. Venom attacks and figures she must know where he is, although she legitimately doesn't. So before Venom heads out, he casually mentions that Parker's wife didn't know where he was either. Adding insult to injury, literally. She got a broken nose, and then he's like, hey, by the way, he's married, so your night just went from good to the opposite. What a terrible night too. Imagine getting your nose broken and then someone's like, hey, by the way, she's married. Number 6, leave a trail. When Eddie Brock was doing time at Rikers Island, his cellmate just happened to be Cletus Cassidy, who was in there for, let's just say, some horrible things. So when Venom came and reunited there with Eddie, part of the symbiote was left behind as they were breaking out, taking over Cletus Cassidy. This guy was horrible beforehand. I mean, he was in there because he took out tons of guys and he bragged about it the entire time. He's sick. So that plus the symbiote equals Carnage, making its first debut in Amazing Spider-Man 361, Carnage Part 1. He's one of the biggest, baddest villains in the comic, and I'm actually looking forward to seeing Woody Harrelson play him in the live-action Venom sequel. Now, while most of this can be pinned on Cletus being the main problem here, we have to add it to the list. Always make sure you don't leave any space goop behind, especially not in prison. Come on, Venom, who do you think's gonna grab it? Number 5, ditch the gear. Sometimes when you don't need something anymore, you drop it like it's hot. Like that scene from Forrest Gump, where Forrest runs out of his leg braces. But now sometimes when you realize you don't need something and you get rid of it, sometimes you just happen to be Venom, and sometimes that thing you no longer need is Angelo Fortunato. So back in 2005, Marvel wanted to reboot Venom. So the new Venom host was Don Fortunato, after he won the symbiote in an auction. What a great win, by the way. I would definitely bet on that. He gave the suit to his son Angelo to make him more tough. Okay, sure, it works. Hey, trust me, man, it works. Eddie warned him about the risks, but Angelo didn't listen. Angelo attacked Spider-Man and ripped out his heart, only to discover that it was just an imposter. And then after a fight with Spider-Man, Angelo just left out of fear. He was getting his butt kicked, he wanted nothing to do with it. And Venom wasn't a fan of that, so he left the host mid-air. Mid-air, he just dropped him like it's hot. But his gear wasn't working properly after the fight Angelo had just caused, so how unfortunate is that? Number 4, killed Uncle Ben. On Earth 2301, better known as Marvel's Mangaverse, we see Ben Parker part of the Spider Clan. He's skilled and ambitious, and he even plans to open his own martial arts school. How badass is that? So during this time, he was teaching a young Peter Parker the ways of the Spider Clan. When one day Peter was rushing to avoid being late to the dojo, he was surprised to see all the lights were off. Weird. I wonder if there's like a surprise party or something, or maybe Venom's here. Let's hope it's the first one. With his last words being, "With great power comes great responsibility," he died at the hands of Venom. There's a nice scene later on where the two talk again, and Uncle Ben gives the advice needed to Peter in this dreamlike sequence. It's beautiful, but the damage Venom did on this Earth was permanent. And sad too, quite sad. Number 3, Lee Price. When Venom bonds to a host, depending on who that person is, things could be manageable. Like Eddie Brock, for example, things are manageable, it's kind of workable. But sometimes they can be even worse than before. Like in the case of Lee Price. Lee had a pretty rough time growing up. He was bullied, and his father wasn't the best role model by any way, and he treated his mother in an awful way as well. Just not a great guy, not a great house. So in order to escape this horrid living situation, Lee thought it best to burn down the apartment, all while his parents were still in there. Like I said, not a nice guy. And to get away with it, he blamed it all on a mutant with pyrokinesis, who at the time was his friend. So Lee suppressed this for years, and he grew up actually believing that the boy had actually done this. And he also thought that his dad had abandoned him the whole time. That's how far his brain has gone believing this. Later in life, he spent 5 years as a ward of the state before joining the army, until an explosion resulted in the loss of a couple squad members and a couple of fingers. Already a tough life, now enter Venom. You know it's bad when even Venom is trying to unbond with you. That's how you know. Lee used the symbiote for awful things, so much so that Venom was actually relieved once Lee had left the picture. Number 2, Anne Weying. Anne first met Eddie Brock at Empire State University. She made her comic book debut back in Amazing Spider-Man issue 375. She reflects on how once upon a time her and Eddie were in love. That's right, he was smart, witty, with a boyish charm that swept her off her feet. So what happened? Well, while they were married, Eddie became a journalist for the Daily Globe, and she was a lawyer. So far sounds great. Sounds like a lovely household with people doing great work. After she divorced him, things only got worse for her. Like for example, I don't know, she was shot by the villain Sin Eater. Yeah. And then after that, Eddie figured it's a good idea to loan her some of the symbiote to heal her up. Now it worked, but the only downside is now we have a she-Venom for a bit. She ended up ending the lives of 2 men who attacked her, so once the symbiote was returned to Eddie, she had to live with all of those memories. Unlike Lee, who had time to kind of erase and forget and just trick his mind into believing he didn't do these horrible things. Anne had this for like a hot minute, and then it went away while she was an adult. She's like, I know what happened. And it doesn't work out well for her. She was traumatized until the end of her life. She couldn't even leave her own apartment. Even for such a short amount of time, Venom can cause quite stress levels. Number 1, planetary attack. In Venom Space Knight issue 8, the symbiote teaches Flash Thompson a lesson about its past. Back to where it all began. Back to where the first host was born. Yeah, so after the two had bonded, he went back to his homeworld and took out everybody. Now all that remains are just graves of the dead. Venom describes this first host as a cruel and twisted soul, one who showed Venom the cruelty and twistedness of his own soul. He killed everybody on this planet, so naturally I have to put him at number 1.
Number 10 formed the Avengers. If you thought Nick Fury brought the Avengers together, then you might be surprised to hear this. In the comics, however, it was not Fury's plot that brought all of Earth's mightiest heroes together, but Loki's. Granted, Loki hadn't planned on doing so, and in the end it actually resulted in way more trouble for him and many other villains in the Marvel-verse besides than he could have ever imagined. Loki was the first villain the team would come up against in Avengers issue number 1, and the villain who would unite them together, much like in the MCU actually, but with less scepters and invasions and with more tricks and illusions and like magic. Loki tricked the Hulk into destroying a train track, thereby endangering human lives. And although no one was hurt because the Hulk actually saved everyone from his own breaking of the train track, the people still saw the Hulk as a monster, and it was this event that brought the Avengers together. In the end, it was revealed that Loki was behind all of it, and the Avengers ended up uniting to defeat him. So yeah, this was one of the worst things Loki kinda did to himself even. That's super tricksy. Number 9. United Villains. It almost felt like Loki was trying to make up for doing something really good for the heroes in the world, and for, causing a bunch of harmful things for himself when he brought the Avengers together with this plot. During the Acts of Vengeance crossover, Loki, under the guise of a businessman, used his skills as a master manipulator to bring together the Prime Movers, a very contradictory team of powerful villains who all hated the Avengers and heroes in general, and sought to destroy them by attacking them with less conventional villains. The team was made up of Doctor Doom, Kingpin, Mandarin, Wizard, Magneto, and Red Skull, and their plan was actually pretty solid. It sounds like it wouldn't work, but it actually worked pretty well. However, even Loki couldn't manage to keep the group together, and they ended up breaking up, mostly due to everyone's mutual hatred of Red Skull. Which, yeah, I get it. Also, when you put Magneto and Red Skull on a team together, I mean, what do you expect to happen? They're obviously gonna break up. It's a terrible match. Number 8. Thor croaks. Are we going to talk about the frog thing? You bet we're gonna talk about the frog thing, because this is a part 1, so we gotta talk about it. One of the most bizarre and yet great schemes Loki has committed to date was when he devised to have Thor turned into a frog in order to get his do-good brother out of the way so that he might rule Asgard in his place. Not only is this awful because, turning your brother into a frog is never a nice thing to do, but we aren't just talking about anyone here. This is Thor. The transformation was even worse for the God of Thunder, who often prides himself on his prowess and strength as a warrior. As a frog, he was robbed of his natural sense of courage and his eagerness for battle initially, and as Frog Thor, he had to rediscover this before eventually, of course, being returned to his standard form, and getting revenge back on Loki, because that's how this always goes, unless we're in like an alternate Earth.
Coming in at number 7, we have Gibbon. We got back-to-back orphanage stories for you. In fact, this one sounds like a cross between Mindworm and Robin. Gibbon is basically the missing link. He has all the abilities of a chimp that are amplified way up. He's got super strength, speed, awareness, reflexes. This guy is off the charts when you're talking about his Madden stats. But because of his monkey-like ways, the kids didn't really like him in the orphanage, and he was never adopted. Now, this ended with him growing up and leaving like a regular dude, but now he was just a freak with no money, so he decided he could use his mutations to make some cash. And what's the best way for an oddity to make a quick buck? Well, the circus, of course. There you would think he would be among his people, but he was rejected once again, and now he turned to a life of villainy. When we first see Gibbon, he's just a dude that has some monkey skills, but in later renditions of his character, he looks like a full-on ape man. And even though he has the abilities to take down Spidey, the clashes between the two always end up with Gibbon on his butt. Coming in at number 6, we have the Answer. Now this guy is actually pretty cool. He's just used in a very lame way, and his name sucks. The Answer was already a skilled assassin. He was working for the mob boss of all mob bosses, Wilson Fisk. Anyone Fisk wanted taken down, he was all over it. And part of why he was so good at his job was because the Answer, at this time he was known as Aaron Nichols, is extremely intelligent. He showcases genius level problem solving skills, and he can come up with the answer to any problem. And this is all before he ever gets any sort of superpowers. There was a time in comics when the Kingpin was just handing out superpowers, but you don't give the first powers to someone you can't trust, so he of course gave his first dose of super juice to his buddy Aaron. But at first glance, nothing happened, which is probably a relief and a bummer, because if you take some sort of experimental drug to give yourself powers, you want to get the superpowers, but you also don't want to come out a freak. But later, the Answer learns that he has one of the most powerful superpowers I have ever heard of. No matter what the situation, when he is faced with a conflict, his body will supply him with the powers to counter who or whatever he's fighting. So normally he's just a guy, but when the time calls for it, he can fly or create force fields or get super strength. But after a run-in with Spidey that he wins, the character just kind of disappears and we don't see him that much. This guy fits on this list because of the wasted potential. Coming in at number 5, we have Kangaroo. I brought this up in the first first video. If you're a villain or a hero and you're choosing your power, you don't have to pick something lame. It seems like some of these villains focus way too much on the branding of their super persona rather than the powers. With Kangaroo, it seemed that the villain was set on theming themselves after kangaroos rather than having a cool power. He has implants in his legs that allow him to jump very far, and he's also a skilled boxer. Like, not the worst combination of things, but when you're hell bent on taking out Spidey by stomping on him, you're probably going to lose a lot. There was this weird time in the 70s and 80s where Australia was this thing that the media was trying to push. It was foreign, it was interesting, no one really knew how to sell it. The closest that we got was Crocodile Dundee. But this villain seems like the big wigs at Marvel wanted to make an Australian themed villain because they thought kids would like it, rather than thinking of a good character first. Coming in at number 4, we have The Swarm. Have you guys seen that episode of South Park where they make a joke that the writers from Family Guy are just manatees in a tank and they all pull out 3 random topics to base an episode around? Well, that's what The Swarm feels like. They were like, German scientists, killer bees, purple cape. This dude is lame, not only because he's a swarm of bees that is being controlled by a dead scientist's consciousness, but also because this dude gets beat by bug repellent. When him and Spidey face off, Spidey's able to beat him by spraying down his suit in bug spray, and then the swarm literally can't get close enough to fight and has to run away. If your weakness can be purchased at Home Depot, then you're a pretty lame villain if you ask me. Coming in at number 3, we have Grizzly. I like how in the Marvel universe, if you're a bear enthusiast, you'll eventually get superpowers and become one of the lamest villains that Peter Parker has to fight on a semi-regular basis. But if you're a bear enthusiast in real life, you just get eaten by bears. 2 very different outcomes. Well, Maxwell Markham was just that, a dude who loves bears, and get this, he was also a wrestler who hurt his fellow wrestlers too much, so he got kicked out of the league. We got a dude who loves bears, he used to be a wrestler. What's the third thing that's going to set this guy into the manatee formula? Oh, he was also given a bear suit that would hook him up with some superpowers. Where did he get this suit? Well, he got it from the Jackal, who's one of Spider-Man's best villains, but that dude has a lot of dud moves. I feel like the Jackal just wakes up some days and is like, what if I gave a dude a bear suit so he thought he was a real villain and then Spider-Man would have to deal with it? That would be jokes. Some of his plots sound more like pranks than actual schemes to cause mayhem. Coming in at number 2, we have Hypno Hustler. Next, we have a villain that not only has a lame weakness, but their powers were used to such a small scale that doesn't really make any sense why this character was ever made. Hypno Hustler is Anthony Delsoen, and he has music that can take over your mind. His songs allow him to control people around him and then they do his bidding. But the thing is, if he hears his own music, he will also become hypnotized. He can't even handle his own groovy music, which seems strange. I've never heard of a hypnotist hypnotizing themselves. But when we first see Hypno Hustler, he's shaking people down for just their pocket change at a show. I feel like this guy should have had bigger dreams. If he got one of his songs on the radio, he could have taken over the world. And coming at the number 1 spot, we have Humbug. Here's the thing, when you hear that there's a hero based off a spider, that's kinda cool because at least spiders are scary, they make web, they do some interesting things. But when you hear there's a villain that just has a general insect theme, you can throw that one in the trash. I really couldn't dislike this villain more. For one, he should be able to beat Spider-Man because he's got a super suit that gives him skills that are on par with the web slinger. But this guy has the worst weakness of all, a love for bugs. He loves bugs so much that Spider-Man has been able to halt this guy from a life of crime by telling him he's going to smash some cockroaches. Like, dude, give your head a shake.
Kicking off the list at number 10, put on a show. Okay, Peter's life is pretty balanced. I mean, he takes selfies for the Daily Bugle, gets a little bit of cash, gets thrown off a building, has to fight a giant lizard, you name it. With Peter's life, his superhero and work go hand in hand. So in the Amazing Spider-Man issue 4, released back in 1963, we see Peter and he had just finished laying out Sandman. But he forgot to snag a couple of photos of the action. He didn't take any selfies, which is the worst. It's like when you blow candles out on your cake and then your mom's like, no, you blinked, light them up again. Gotta keep trying this, it's for the scrapbook, let's go. Then you're like, I'm tired. So Peter grabs sand, like just sand off the ground, tosses it up in the air, and then punches through the sand. He's like, yeah, people are gonna buy this, it's the Sandman. And then people do buy it. What a liar. He comes back in all cool, out of breath, like, good people, you can breathe easy. Meanwhile, his Instagram is just popping off with likes. God, what a liar. I mean, you gotta do what you gotta do. You gotta get clout. You gotta get that super clout. And before we list off some more of Peter's dark days, if you guys could go ahead and toss us a thumbs up, because it really helps us out here at the studio. If we get enough likes, they won't kill me. Number 9. Giving away Edith. Following the events of Avengers Endgame, aka the Snappening, we see Peter Parker trying to move on in a very new world, while mourning the loss of a co-worker and father figure that is Tony Stark. He wants to just live a normal life. He wants to go away on a trip with his friends and not have any moons hucked at him from any Titans. So after trying to ghost Nick Fury in the process, he's handed down Edith, Tony's sweet AI glasses. After a mix-up that almost had his classmate executed by one of Tony's drones, he decides that the handsome, caped, random Jake Gyllenhaal that just came out of nowhere as Mysterio is a safe bet for the tech. I mean, he looks great in the glasses, but like, it's Jake Gyllenhaal. He's gonna look great in anything. But come on, Peter, you think after toying with Stark's suit years before that maybe it's a little bit too much responsibility? I'll get into that later. Number 8, the Betty Brant affair.
Hey, Betty.
So Betty is a staff member at the Daily Bugle. She's been played by Elizabeth Banks in the Tobey Maguire trilogy, and Angourie Rice plays a younger version of her in the new MCU Tom Holland version. Believe it or not though, Betty was actually the first woman that Peter was attracted to when he first started selling photos to the Daily Bugle. So they dated for a bit, but ultimately it didn't work out. No biggie, it happens. Cut to years down the road, Peter's marriage proposal didn't work out too well. She said no, and Betty's marriage to Ned at this point was also not working out. She was having a bit of a rough patch. So she went to Peter for some comfort, and then the obvious happened. She's still married, Pete. Don't do it.
Your shots are so good.
I'd love to shoot you sometime.
Peter Parker. Peter.
Number 7 was defeated? But how can this be the worst? Well, because it put Loki in a position of great power, and he would have gotten away with it too if it wasn't for his meddling brother Thor. Some theorize that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Loki actually allowed himself to be defeated by the Avengers in that first film. The whole invading Earth wasn't actually something he wanted or needed, but it was actually all part of a grander scheme to get caught and then be put in exactly the place he needed and in fact wanted to be in order for him to later take over Asgard. Of course, we don't know if this is true or if he was really the puppet in an even greater scheme where Thanos was the master the whole time, which does kind of sound more likely, but I like to think that almost everything has been part of Loki's plan, including any deaths he's seemingly suffered, because he's just a master manipulator. Also, all these deaths are all fake, and I don't believe any of them. I see you, Loki. Even that last one. We got that last one, everyone was like, oh, he's definitely dead, and I was like, he'll be back. I don't believe it. And he is back now. Granted, it's a different version of him, but still, I'm gonna take it and I'm gonna say, don't believe any of it. Don't believe any deaths. They're all lies. Number 6, impersonated Scarlet Witch. And while impersonating her, also kinda made out with Clint Barton, who was Ronin at the time. In fact, this is one of the things that tipped the heroes off to her true identity, because apparently Clint has some kind of magical kissing power. Wait a minute, that's not Scarlet Witch. I would know her kiss anywhere. Since when did Clint and Wanda make out enough for him to be able to identify her kiss instantly? Also, how different are Loki's and Wanda's kissing styles? I want to know. Like, are they radically different? Are they a little different? What level are we talking about here? Loki's plan here, of course, was to impersonate Wanda so he could help create his own team of Avengers, which he would then use against Norman Osborn. Perhaps he was resentful because he wasn't invited to Osborn's Dark Avengers? How rude. While multiple people were suspicious that it wasn't Wanda, eventually Loki's illusion was broken fully by Wiccan, Wanda's reincarnated, formerly self-constructed son. I hope that makes sense to you. That's what he is, I don't know. Before we move on to the next spot, it's time to do that thing. You know that thing where you click that like button if you are liking this video. Yeah, do the thing. Number 5, betrayed Thor. Was anyone surprised? No, not even Thor was surprised on this one, but it didn't make it any less awful. This moment comes to us from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In Thor Ragnarok, after Loki and Thor finally seem to be willing to put the past behind them and work together for once to save Asgard, Loki decides to betray his brother yet again. He plans to alert the authorities and have Thor captured in exchange for a hefty reward, meaning that Thor would be likely eternally imprisoned and trapped on Sakaar Sakaar, which would also leave Asgard eternally doomed with Hela in charge. Easier to let it burn, Loki says, before Thor reveals he was expecting the betrayal and tases him remotely. Number 4. Tried to fool the X-Men and almost succeeded. During the 80s, Alpha Flight and X-Men had a team-up 2-part story, which of course started with both teams fighting one another, but all due to a greater misunderstanding. And yeah, actually Alpha Flight during the 80s was a big thing. It was huge. We don't talk about Alpha Flight much anymore, but they were a big deal back then. Loki was up to some sneaky business here where he was trying to convince the northern gods that he was, trying to help mortals. He was a good guy, when really he was trying to create chaos. Surprise, surprise. He had a fire fountain at his disposal, which not only sounds super flashy, but also granted magical clothing and cool powers to mortals, as well as I believe eternal life. The X-Men ended up in the city containing the fire fountain after their plane went down and crashed landed. In the end, Alpha Flight, who went to investigate and found them, who had a quick tussle with their friends, who at the time thought the city was great, before Loki revealed himself and the mutants were able to unite to defeat him after learning that the powers, magic clothing, and eternal life granted came with a price. The destruction of magical beings like Alpha Flight member Snowbird. Oh no, Snowbird! Fortunately, Loki was foiled, but this was a pretty diabolical plot. Number 3. Bartered with Enchantress's hand. Not my hand! But also, this is very serious. I don't know why I'm laughing, it's very serious, this is terrible. Loki did this not once even, but twice. Both times Idun was not even consulted, and the second time around she was full on tricked by Loki. Idun was known as the keeper of golden apples. She is very important to the Asgardian people because of her being the only person who can pick the golden apples, which are what grant the Asgardians their eternal youth and vitality, making them immortal as well. So it's a really important job. The first time it was Loki who promised, but also managed to avoid Enchantress being married off, but this only resulted in greater trouble for Thor when it was revealed the mason he had bartered with was actually a frost giant in disguise. So he tricked him and then he kind of had to fight a frost giant. That's where Thor comes in. The second time he once again promised her hand to a frost giant in order to save his own skin from starvation and from his own banishment. This time around Thor once again had to save the day, but Idun was still imprisoned for a time and likely traumatized from the whole experience in the end. Number 2. Stole Sif's body. This has to be by far one of the worst things that Loki has done. And what's worse, he did it for the most petty of reasons. Like many of his antics, it was simply to piss off Thor. At first, Thor actually wondered why Loki had returned to life, resurrected in a female form, but Loki played it off as just like, oh, this is just some coincidence, I just happened to be reincarnated in a female body, don't worry about it. Later, however, we'd learn about the horror that Lady Loki really was. Loki in Sif's body having stolen her body, the body of his enemy, to parade around in and just use as he pleased. Ugh. This also greatly affected Lady Sif even after she had her body back. She remarked how even though she was supposed to be this strong and fearless warrior, she found herself trembling at the slightest unknown shadow, terrified that Loki was lurking around a corner waiting to return and claim her body as his own. Ugh, I don't like that. Number 1. Killed his younger self. Kid Loki was one of the best versions of Loki we'd ever got. And by best, I mean the most honest, the most true, the kindest, the most heroic. He was a trickster, but a seemingly innocent one, a nice one. Kid Loki was on a path of redemption. He was basically a hero, but not even Loki could let Loki redeem himself. Seeing that no one would ever see him as anything other than the god of lies, no matter how much good he did, King Loki took out revenge on everyone around him, eventually even killing his own more naive persona and self, Kid Loki. Or really, more younger Loki at this point. Basically, Kid Loki is like a younger version of King Loki. It's all Loki, but yeah, he killed the nicest Loki. Sad.
Coming in at number 10, we've got an honorable mention for the time that the immortal Hulk buried a similarly immortal villain alive within a mountain, in an incident that was a bit less embarrassing and a bit more existentially terrifying. While on the run, the Hulk found himself running into a mad scientist known as Dr. Fry, who had attempted to conquer death through the use of gamma radiation and had accidentally both poisoned his hometown and turned himself into a glowing skeletal creature that would cannibalize cannibalize anyone stumbling across his mountain cave. Since he was unable to kill him, the Hulk wound up trapping Dr. Fry within his mountain cave without the use of his arms or legs, essentially burying him alive. Note to self: do not get on the Hulk's bad side while also being immortal. Coming in at number 9, we've got either the best or worst Hulk pun of all time used against the Red King. Following his exile from planet Earth, the Hulk found himself as a gladiator combatant on the planet Sakaar, battling in fights overseen by the cruel leader of the planet, Angmo Asan, aka the Red King. In a final battle to take back the planet, the Hulk led a force of rebels against their captors, and went head-to-head against the Red King inside his own arena in a sword duel to the death. And while the fight itself was pretty cool, the icing on the cake was the final pun as the Hulk defeated his foe with his sword and cried out, "Hulk slash." Coming in at number 8, we have the Incredible Hulk vs. Black Bolt, King of the Inhumans. Following the Hulk's extended stay on Sakaar, and following the death of the love that he'd found on the planet, the Hulk began making his way back to Earth to face off against the heroes that had sent him into the cosmos in the first place. He was intercepted on the Earth's moon by Black Bolt, who used his incredibly destructive voice to whisper enough at the Hulk when he refused to back down. An attack that likely would have killed anyone else, but left the Hulk still standing, grinning, and saying, "I didn't come here for a whisper, I want to hear you scream," which just might be the most badass thing ever dared to be said to Black Bolt.
Number 7, Avon Calling. Not necessarily a great supervillain of Wolverine's per se, but in issue number 30 of the original Wolverine series, Wolverine managed to embarrass a whole team of Madripoorian militia and palace guards when he was dealing with the masterminds behind the Lazarus Project. As he and his allies aim to infiltrate the palace and confront General Koi, Broker, not to be confused with the Power Broker, and Dr. Page, Wolverine walks right up to the guard, and when he asks who goes there, answers, "Avon Calling." Wolverine can be nonchalant and make jokes here because he's got Karma on his team. Rather than respond with an attack, Karma basically takes hold of the guard's mind and then has him take them into the palace under the guise of his prisoners. Of course, this ruse doesn't last for too long, but it does last long enough to get them into the palace at least, and to basically where they need to go. Number 6, Ruined Merchant's Auction. When Wolverine donned his patch disguise to return once more to Madripoor, it was quickly revealed to him that everyone kinda already knew who he was. And while he had come to save a former teammate from being auctioned off as a weapon, he himself ended up on the auctioning block. But although the merchant saw his presence as an opportunity, in the end he realized his mistake, as Wolverine didn't just get away with Maverick as intended, but pretty much ruined his whole auction and Merchant's whole catalog besides. You can check out how badly Wolverine ruined this party by checking out issues number 9 and 10 of the 2020 Wolverine series. Number 5, Resisted the Change. Wolverine's healing factor doesn't just protect him from severe injuries, it also protects him against supernatural related monster rules, such as how they dictate transformations. And if he does end up getting affected by said rules, the change is typically only temporary for him. Eventually his healing factor will basically cure him. Case in point, when Old Man Logan faced off with Dracula during his hunt for Jubilee. Dracula managed to attack Wolverine and even bite him in this second volume of Old Man Logan, but the joke was on Drac. Wolverine's healing factor protected him from giving into vampirism, and we learned that he was immune to said bite and its effects. Sorry, Dracula. In the end, Wolverine came out on top, managing to later on decapitate Dracula. Obviously, he came back, but for the Prince of Darkness, King of Lies, Lord of the Undead, this was a pretty embarrassing defeat. Especially as he bit him and then he was like, yes, this didn't work, but that's fine. I'm sure it's taking all of your healing factor to fight off the vampirism. I don't know if it was actually taking all of his healing factor. He did look a little rough, but I feel like Wolverine was like, yeah, sure, bub, all of my healing factor. Number 4, Bad Karaoke for Maverick and Merchant. Later on in the current Wolverine series, Maverick would take a job from Merchant, deciding in the end to work with him despite Merchant attempting to auction him off previously, and thereby putting Maverick in the crosshairs of Wolverine. With the two at odds fighting over information stored on a Krakoan bug, Wolverine in the end decided to let Maverick think he stole that bug back from him and his friend CIA agent Jeff Bannister, only for Maverick to learn later while handing it over to Merchant that the bug was actually wiped clean and the information on it replaced with tons of Johnny Cash karaoke, likely taken from performances at the Green Lagoon's karaoke night. Oh boy.
Coming in at number 3, we have the Hulk killing Maestro with the explosion that created him in the first place. Bruce Banner often has to face off against different mental versions of the Hulk inside his head, but this alternate version of himself from a post-apocalyptic future is the real deal. Naming himself Maestro after conquering what remains of America following a nuclear winter, this version of the Hulk had become far stronger than the Hulk's usual starting strength, with years of sucking up deadly radiation only improving his ferocity and power. When the real Hulk encountered this warlord version of himself, the only way he was able to finally come out on top was by literally warping the Maestro back in time to be killed by the same gamma bomb that created the Hulk back in the 60s. A nice bit of circular karma that showed that Bruce Banner could outwit even his older self. Coming in at number 2, we have Zombie Hulk versus Zombie Thanos. The Hulk and Thanos might not have gone to get a proper physical rematch in the MCU, but in the Marvel multiverse, their zombie versions had a fight that has to be seen to be believed. 40 years after the initial infection that turned their universe into an undead wasteland, a zombified Thanos decides to pick a fight with an undead Hulk, claiming that the Hulk has eaten more flesh than his fair share. With the eloquence that only a zombie can provide, the Hulk responded by crushing Thanos' skull between his clapping palms, instantly destroying the weakened Mad Titan and showing that maybe you shouldn't tell the Hulk he's been eating too much lately.
At number 10, it is the time when Iron Man almost kills a non-Cyttorak powered Juggernaut. In this exchange, Juggernaut is on a tear, and Thor, Ghost, Luke Cage, and Iron Man appear to try and put a stop to him. Iron Man warns Juggernaut with total confidence to stand down cause the numbers are against him. Juggernaut then basically hits L2 and activates his taunt saying, "Then it's almost even." Should not have said that. So instead of humoring any more of this back and forth, Iron Man promptly follows through with his threat and blasts Juggernaut, almost killing him. The blast he hits him with is a sonic beam that he's used before to put down a whole regiment. The attack injures Juggernaut so badly that he's basically like steaming and bleeding from every orifice on his face. It's so bad that Luke Cage has to stop Iron Man before he kills the Juggernaut there and then. And it's pretty clear that Juggernaut had no idea that Iron Man would dominate the battle this much. And it becomes one of the many moments where Iron Man is able to come through and show everyone that he's not only one of the most powerful in the room, but that he's also willing to follow through. Okay, at number 9, we have the time when Iron Man is called to free hostages from an enclosure made of adamantium and vibranium, two of the strongest materials in the known universe. Remember, adamantium is the metal that reinforces Wolverine's skeleton and what his claws are made of, and vibranium is what Black Panther's weapons are made of, which can absorb and amplify sonic energy. So when Cardiac traps his hostages in a massive enclosure made of these materials, he clearly doesn't believe that there's any chance anyone could thwart his plans. But when Iron Man arrives on scene, he promptly backs himself up and basically turns his body into a human missile, rocketing towards the enclosure and busting a huge hole in it with his fist. This allows oxygen to enter the chamber, giving the team much more time to eventually save the hostages entirely. He does break his arm and a few ribs, but once again, he takes a villain's confidence and absolutely shatters it with his supreme power and iron will. At number 8, we have an event that is counted widely as one of Iron Man's most powerful feats. Mandarin and Iron Man find themselves facing off against a common enemy, an army of dragons led by Fin Fang Foom and Chen Su. And the dragons seem to be winning. After some pretty close calls, Iron Man and Mandarin seem to be at a stalemate, realizing that the dragons are just not letting up. At this very moment, Chen Su morphs back into dragon form and makes a final appeal to Mandarin for the rings, citing their power and how he is ill-equipped to control them himself. Iron Man realizes that this may be true, but that he is much more than a man, so he could himself unleash the true power of the rings, and he does. He grabs Mandarin's hands and unleashes an enormous explosion that levels a few mountain ranges as well as Fin Fang Foom and Chen Su in one go. This is another moment where a major enemy underestimates Iron Man's superhuman abilities and pays the price for it.
Coming in at number 7, we have the Ultimate Hulk literally eating Herr Kaiser. As one of the first major enemies faced by the Ultimate Superhero Team, Kaiser was a Chitauri warrior that had infiltrated Earth during the Second World War and was able to fight toe-to-toe with both Nick Fury and the Super Serum enhanced Captain America. As a last-ditch effort to defeat the villain, the Ultimates unleashed the Hulk to defeat their shape-shifting foe, who decided to ensure Kaiser could never return by eating his corpse and then destroying the feces that resulted from the meal. There's overkill, and then there's being overkilled by the Hulk. Coming in at number 6, we have the Ultimate Hulk versus Ultimate Abomination. In another example of the Ultimate Hulk being vicious as hell, the Abomination was an attempt to recreate the conditions that had made the Hulk, but hoping to improve the process and allow him to be controlled. The Abomination had all of the Hulk's strength, but retained all of his human brain power after the transformation, which was intended to help the Abomination permanently put down the Hulk, but still led to Abomination being absolutely torn to shreds, with the Hulk adding salt to the wound by claiming, "You think too much," a final backhanded insult to show that being smarter isn't always going to lead to better outcomes.
Number 10, being named traitor. As awful as this one is, it ranks a little lower on our list because, well, Wanda kind of deserved this one. After the events of House of M, Wanda was seen as one of the biggest mutant traitors around, still being believed at this point to be a mutant. Oddly enough, Scarlet Witch was one of the few prominent mutants in comics who has never been part of the X-Men team, and was really only an Avenger. If you're wondering why that is, a big part of it in the later years has to do with mutants hating her due to the fact that she basically wiped them from existence with her wish of no more mutants, which we now refer to as decimation. Well, that, and she was initially too busy serving on her father's villainous team of mutants, the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. Still, although she did earn the title traitor, much of what has happened as a result of House of M happened because of basically how harshly people were treating Wanda. So, although she earned the title traitor, it still feels a little harsh to say that she entirely deserved it. I've always thought of Wanda as more of a misguided villain when she plays that role, as opposed to a true and sincere villain in the comics. Number 9. Cast as a villain. To expand on our previous point a bit more, a few of the worst things that have happened to Scarlet Witch usually involve her being cast in some kind of villainous role, despite the fact that she is truly a hero when it all comes down to it. Scarlet Witch only ever wants to do what's best, and usually it's some kind of outward manipulation or force that turns her momentarily evil, or causes her to break down and commit some kind of heinous action. It does make for some pretty interesting stories, but it's pretty awful the number of times and how severely Scarlet Witch has been used in this way by others, and when it comes to storytelling. Number 8, betrayed by her fiance. Remember when Wanda was about to marry Dr. Doom, and then it was implied that he really only wanted to be with her because he wanted to take her power from her? Granted, it seemed like he also wanted to do so to help her and help the world, but of course, it's still Doom, so you can bet that ego and selfishness were a big part of the reasoning behind this plot as well. Scarlet Witch no longer remembered who she was when her reincarnated son and member of the Young Avengers, Wiccan, came to find her. All she knew was that she loved Victor Von Doom and was ready to marry him, despite the fact that he had kind of manipulated her. Her love was real, but the backstory that she believed she belonged to wasn't. Wanda ended up spurned and mistreated by Doom even after the truth came out, and she still tried to help him. And before we move on to this next point, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying it. It really does help us out, I promise.
Number 7, more secrets. Marriage is a big deal, as we kind of just mentioned. I mean, maybe in comic books they happen way more often than they should. So many characters get divorced every other day, I swear. Like, divorce lawyers must make millions of dollars in the comics. Holy shit. But the whole point of a proper marriage is to have everything out there on the table, right? You have to know everything about your significant other. No secrets. I mean, sure, if you're Spider-Man, you have to keep some things to yourself, like the fact that you're Spider-Man. Because maybe your friends will go and say something and then the Green Goblin will hear and then he'll blow up your house or something, or toss your aunt out of a window. I get it. But MJ already knew about Peter Parker being Spider-Man. Of course she did. So right after he had resumed taking on the mantle of the Webhead again, he failed to fill in MJ. Yeah, he told her he'd quit and then he didn't tell her that he was, not quitting anymore. Like, dude, she already knew before. Stop making up lies. What are you, Walter White? It's very obvious you're up to something. Everybody's onto it. Number 6, blackmail for a date. So that One More Day storyline that has been mentioned before in our channel that I'll talk about a little bit more at the end of this list is a pretty pivotal moment in Spider-Man comics. So after this deal had taken place, Spider-Man was now single and ready to mingle. So in Ms. Marvel issue 34, we see a new Peter bump into Ms. Marvel. And she's in the middle of this sketchy and totally unplanned mission, as Peter puts it, with the CIA. And she can't use her powers, and she's currently on the run from Norman Osborn, who turned S.H.I.E.L.D. into Hammer at this point. It's wild. So bumping into Peter was pretty ideal at this point. He webbed her to safety, all the while they bickered at each other trying to figure out what's going on, what they're up to, what their real intentions are. And then Carol thanks him with a super knee, bam, right between the legs, and then explains to Peter that she needs his help, which is a good order. That's how you do things in that order. I need help. Can you drive me to the airport? If I do this, says Pete, then I want a date with you, which we see come to fruition 13 issues later. So when Carol responded surprised, he even acknowledged that he didn't realize he was gonna say that until it came out. Cool, maybe it just slipped out. But then once she leaves and agrees to it, he's like, yo, I think I just got a date, score. Come on, Pete. A lot of come on Pete's in this, eh? A lot of just what are you doing, dude? Number 5, truce? Question mark? So at some point it's fair to make a truce, okay? Maybe the conflicts just don't have realistic expectations, and then both parties are like, you know what, this has gone on way too long, let's just call it, no hard feelings. Bam. Like Spider-Man 3, when Pete and Harry teamed up to save the day against Venom and Sandman. That was a great moment. Moviegoers were thrilled to see the end of Bad Boy James Franco and Bad Boy Tobey Maguire. Like, just stop dancing and snapping at people, just fight, I don't know. But in the comics, he made a pretty questionable truce with Venom. And it all happens in The Amazing Spider-Man 375. Spider-Man's parents get kidnapped by Venom. So he's like, no problem, I'll just roll up with your ex-wife. What's up? Let's make a deal. What do you got? So Spider-Man saved her life, so in return, a truce was to be made. I mean, sure, this was the kickoff to Venom becoming an anti-hero, and then he can have his own run, but also, it's Venom, you know?
Christineth, are you stupid or are you deaf?
Number 4, the fairy incident. Spider-Man Homecoming. Okay, so after intimidating Aaron Davis with his cool, deep voice, Spider-Man figured out the next move for the arms dealers. So Pete decides to take matters into his own hands and prove that he's worthy of being a suitable Avenger. See, this was right after Tony recruited him to help take down Team Cap in Civil War. So he was warm, he got a taste of the action, and now he wants to do more. That's fair, that's why we love Spider-Man. So the Staten Island Ferry was the next location for the Vulture's arms deal to go down. Let's do it, we got the intel, we're rolling in. So he says some quips, webs a few bad guys up, but the Vulture's Chitauri weapon was just too much for Peter to handle, resulting in the ferry to split in half. Right down the middle too, not even like Titanic. So in a last attempt to keep the civilians safe, he tries to hold on to both sides, which is a sick moment. It's kind of like a homage to other Spider-Man moments. It's great, but people are in danger. People are about to drown. There's like cars that are sinking. It's bad. And thankfully, with Iron Man's surprise arrival, the passengers were saved. Tony was pissed though. He had this whole setup, there was an inside operation, and then Spidey came in and blew it. And he didn't even tell Tony about what he was doing to make matters all the worse. Which resulted in Tony taking back the Spider-Man suit. It's always the worst part, right after a breakup. You're like, fine, here's your nice sweater. God, I'm so cold now. Number 3, evil assassin Spider-Man. We go now to Earth 8351, where Spider-Man and Wolverine are training together in Alaska. Nice and cold. So they're trying to go rogue, so they're working on becoming stronger, and they're training, they're having a good time. Now, this Peter Parker, he's a bit more rough around the edges. Even his famous catchphrase is now slightly different. See, in this universe, it is, with great power comes great responsibility and greater enemies, which I like more. It's honest, it's definitely better. Doesn't roll off the tongue, but it's a step in the right direction. And it makes sense why he's going rogue. He's truly trying to protect his friends and family, and saying those few extra words at the end just reaffirms his only goal. So when they're attacked, Spider-Man tells Wolverine just to keep hitting people while he deals with a bad guy wielding not one, but 2 swords. So Spider-Man tries webbing him up, and the swords don't allow that. And Spider-Man even gets laughed at for attempting to do this. And Spider-Man says, you're right, that's not gonna work. Bam, shoots him in the face. Huh? They held off long enough until S.H.I.E.L.D. arrived. I mean, sure, this Spider-Man is a different version, but it's still Spider-Man, right? Like, regardless of the title on the front page, this is a moment most fans remembered long after the pages were closed. He like did a cool peace sign too, and then the bullets popped out of his wrist. It was cool. He's like, hey, smell this, bam. Smell this, why the fuck would he say that? Number 2, hit Mary Jane. Spectacular Spider-Man issue 226, we see Ben Reilly and Peter Parker, and the tension is high. They're trying to prove who the real Spider-Man is. It's during all the clone stuff, and they reach a conclusion that Ben Reilly is in fact the real Spider-Man. He is the real father. He is the father. Peter doesn't respond to this well at all. He's upset, obviously. He's watching his entire life basically get stolen in front of him. And then MJ tries to get in the middle, and cool everything down, and Peter instinctively just brushes her off, yelling to leave him alone. Now, you can't really brush somebody off of you when you can lift, I don't know, a bus. He's strong, he's really strong. So him just doing that in a matter of rage, she went flying. And to make matters somehow worse, she was pregnant. Yeah, she was pregnant. And he quickly knew he had messed up, saying, oh God, what have I done? What kind of man am I? I'll tell you what kind of man you are, Spider-Man. You're a guy who gets on a lot of lists of people getting in trouble. That's what you are. Kidding, you're a gem. Stop hitting people. And finally, number 1. The deal with the devil. I mentioned this earlier, now it's time to get into it. Look, sometimes Peter will try and do the right thing. Well, most of the time he'll do the right thing. But then life just gets even harder for him after that. And then he's presented with a new issue to face, and it's like an over and over again thing. It's just a nightmare. And then in 2007, starting with the Amazing Spider-Man issue 544, the storyline One More Day, it's exactly what might happen if you revealed your identity to the public. Following in the footsteps of Tony Stark in the Civil War II storyline, where Peter revealed his true identity in order to support the Superhero Registration Act. So giving out your last name to supervillains, cool, great idea, awesome, nothing bad's gonna happen at all. This of course resulted in Aunt May getting shot, and in order to save her life, he must make a deal with the devil, literally Mephisto. And in doing so, the world will also forget about Peter's true identity. Not a bad deal. The only catch is that Mephisto takes away the marriage of Peter and Mary Jane. And I don't mean a quickie divorce and he's like, hey, sign here, poof. No, I mean it never happened. The relationship is gone, and at the turn of a page, the marriage was just no more. All those memories, all those moments, gone just like that.
Number 10 was creeped upon. Hardcore creeped upon. During Spectacular Spider-Man, there were a few issues where Mary Jane was feeling particularly lonely, and Jason Jerome, an actor she had worked with, saw an opportunity to try and seduce her. Also, Jason Jerome just sounds like the most jerky name ever. If you ever meet someone named Jason Jerome, I feel like you should be warned. Something weird might happen. Also, sorry if your name is Jason Jerome, I'm sure you're a lovely person. Jason insisted he knew how she felt and that she wanted him just as badly as he wanted her. She definitely felt something, but after every move he put on her, she would insist that she loved her husband Peter Parker and wasn't interested, despite her feeling somewhat tempted due to Peter's long absences. In the end, however, she finally told him off by inviting him over, only to toss the bottle of wine that he'd brought with him back at him, causing it to shatter and spill, ruining his pants. Also, I don't know about you, but I've never thrown a bottle of wine so hard that it shattered, especially if it hit a person. I don't know if Jason Jerome is just made of something really hard or what's going on there. I also love that Mary Jane and Peter have a poster of Peter's face by their door, which is really strange. Like a full on, and she's like, this picture of me and Peter. Not creepy at all. Mary Jane had to put up with a lot of Jason being creepy for multiple issues, and even at times appearing to stalk her. Ew. Number 9, used as a human shield. Even when Mary Jane first met Spider-Man, she was smitten with him, even though it was under pretty terrifying circumstances. During one of the first times that Spider-Man ever saved Mary Jane, she was out go-go dancing at a club, hired to dance up on stage and take pictures of the patrons at their tables in between. Suddenly, an attack broke out, featuring goons armed with guns. One of them even manages to take Mary Jane hostage briefly, using her as a human shield. Fortunately, he and his gun are no match for Spider-Man, who thwip clogs up the barrel with his webbing. Spider-Man saves the day and saves Mary Jane. She seems too enamored with Spider-Man to even react to what just happened, but being held at gunpoint and used as a human shield in the middle of a fight has to be traumatizing. However, this wouldn't be Mary Jane's first brush with danger, nor would it be her last. Before we move on to this next point, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying it, and if you want more videos like this, or more videos about Mary Jane, because Mary Jane's awesome. Number 8, got blown up. In one of the most recent issues of Amazing Spider-Man, spoiler alert, skip this point if you don't want me to spoil things. Mary Jane gets blown the heck up by one of Green Goblin's pumpkin bombs. That's right, Green Goblin is back, baby. But of course, the awful part is that Mary Jane is about to end up in the middle of the crossfire after joining Harry Osborn and Peter in a dank crypt for a horrific dinner party. I guess I should say like demon demon Harry Osborn, because he's like part demon, part I don't know what's really fully going on there. It's complex. Mary Jane ends up being pretty much targeted in the explosion after trying to sacrifice herself to save Peter. Ain't that just the way? But somehow, miraculously, she survives at least. It's later revealed what MJ's fate is, but I won't spoil the latest issue for those who haven't gotten to read it yet. Regardless, this one explosive panel was pretty brutal to look at as a fan of Mary Jane. Number 7. Betrayed by her lover. For a guy who loves her, Scott sure has a funny way of showing it during Avengers vs. X-Men. Granted, he was not himself here as he was possessed by the Phoenix Force, but it still really sucked. Also, Emma was possessed by the Phoenix Force at the same time, so I feel like he doesn't get that as an excuse for this one. Emma and Scott were the last of the Phoenix Five to be left standing, wielding the immense power of the Phoenix Force. But while Emma was still relatively doing okay and kind of holding her own with all this power, Cyclops had his mind corrupted and was starting to turn dark. Driven mad by the influence of Dark Phoenix, Scott turned on Emma, taking all her power for himself so that he had enough power to do what he believed needed to be done. And then he used that power to kill Professor X, who tried to stop him. Although I don't think Emma would have minded this part terribly, as she kinda does tend to blame Charles for messing Scott up, so she'd probably be like, well, that's what you get for messing Scott up as a kid, which is evident later as well when she telepathically kicks Charles's butt, and I love that fight. X-Men Legacy, so good! Number 6. Assassinated. This was revealed to have happened at the very end of issue 139 of New X-Men. Emma was shot while in her diamond form with a diamond bullet strong enough to basically shatter her. The horrifying thing was that while not physically alive, her consciousness actually still resided and was essentially trapped within her shards. After an investigation and Emma being returned to life by the efforts of Beast and Jean Grey, it was revealed that Esme, one of Emma's cuckoos, was the one who was to blame. Esme, being one of Emma's students, made this a painful revelation, but it also likely would have been horrifying to be reduced to just bits of consciousness trapped in shards and then be reassembled by Jean's Phoenix Force fire. This whole thing sounds pretty terrible to me. Number 5. Jean Grey broke her. When it comes to the rivalry between Emma and Jean, it's something that has always been there. Even now in Krakoa, when everyone is evolving and moving forward, there is still that spark of competition between the two women, even though now it's at least more of a respectful one than one of pure hatred or distaste. Back when Emma, however, had a psychic affair with Scott, who is Jean's husband at the time, the two were literally like fire and ice with one another, complete opposites and true enemies. The revelation that Emma and Scott were having an affair behind Jean's back caused Jean to completely go off the handle. She brutally, telepathically attacked Emma while trying to get to the bottom of what happened between her and Scott in Hong Kong, making her relive some of her worst traumas to mentally torture Emma, and in the end leaving her broken. Emma was left seeing herself as shallow, spiteful, and manipulative, believing, like Jean, that she was completely in the wrong and losing her sense of confidence and her own high self-esteem. Messing with Jean's relationship left Emma not just burned by her fire, but scorched. In other words, you don't want to mess with Jean Grey. Don't do it. Number 4. Mr. Kendall. Let's talk about the whole teacher-student thing that went on with Emma Frost and Ian Kendall, Emma's teacher. This whole thing is just pretty awful, and also Ian was irresponsible and in the end also terribly judgmental of Emma and broke her heart, which honestly doesn't even make this whole situation much worse because it was already just so awful to begin with. Ugh. As though Emma didn't already have enough on her plate being a villain turned hero in the comics, writers felt that they needed to make Emma even more complex in her own series, Emma Frost, from the early 2000s. So Emma developed a weird romantic relationship with her teacher. She appeared to be the instigator here, but this also seems to be used as a way to kind of like give Mr. Kendall a scapegoat in the end. Like he's like, oh, I didn't want to be attracted to her, but I couldn't help myself. And he's like, you know, I really don't want this, but Emma really wants this. And I'm like, oh my goodness, what's happening here? Emma was like no student, no woman he'd ever known. That's actually something that is said in the series. Oh my goodness. The romance initially was stopped by Emma's father, Winston, when Emma was in high school, but would later resume when Emma ran into Ian again when she was attending university, and was no longer his student. In the end, he rejected her not because their whole relationship was wrong, but because she was a filthy and in his mind dishonest mutant. So that's how that ended. I feel like it should have ended like, actually Actually, this is wrong. The end. But no. Number 3, attack on her school. As Emma became more of a teacher in the comics, she at one point got a school of her own. She ran the school alongside Banshee Sean Cassidy. Her school not only contained mutants, but at one point also operated as a school for non-powered children as well. Emma did her best to keep the peace and, for the most part, was pretty successful until her sister Adrienne showed up and rocked her world. Adrienne had her own plans for Emma and the school. She terrorized both students and her sister when she planted bombs in the school and threatened to blow everyone sky high, attempting to murder many of the students there. Emma managed to fight off Adrienne while students Sync and Banshee handled the bombs, but in the end, it cost Sync his life. He sacrificed himself to save human students when the last bomb couldn't be stopped, which also meant part of the school was blown apart as well. Number 2, punished for having powers. When Emma's parents found out she had powers, rather than accept their daughter or even run in fear of her, they refused to acknowledge that any of it was truly real and decided instead to deal with the problem as if it were any other problem that children from wealthy families such as Emma's suffered. They decided to send Emma to an asylum, but not one really bent on rehabilitating its patients. Her parents referred to it as the clinic. There Emma was doped up and sedated, and it was also implied that the guards took advantage of her vulnerability as well while she was there. Eventually, Emma found a way to reach into the minds of her captors there and was able to manipulate them into helping her escape. Number 1, her team was killed. If there is anything that Emma cherishes and loves the most, it is her students. There is nothing she wouldn't do to protect them, and honestly, in any reality where Emma has become a mother, we've seen just how fiercely loyal and protective she can be when it comes to her own children. The same sentiment in the main continuity generally extends to those that she teaches. So one of the worst things that can ever happen to her, and has ever happened to her, is to see those who put faith in her, those who she helped to grow and teach, killed. That's exactly what happened when her students got caught up in a battle involving Sentinels that were teleported right into the middle of a mutant party, which both the Hellions and Emma happened to be at. Emma was left in a coma in the aftermath, and pretty much all of her Hellions were left dead. And also, remember when I was talking about how Jean mentally tortured her? A lot of what Jean tried to use for that was just basically any experiences where Emma had lost students. Basically, dead students are like Emma's worst nightmare. And her worst reality, poor Emma. Number 10, reshaped the universe. This one only gets ranked lower because it comes to us from the alternate reality of a What If comic. In this What If story, Norman Osborn gets his hands on the Infinity Gauntlet and uses it to reshape reality, all to impress his daddy. What's even more awful is when his father confesses that he actually loves him. Norman then can't even bring himself to believe his father's acceptance, and in the end destroys his father, thereby destroying himself in the process. So this was in a weird way not just a bad thing he did to reality, but also did to his own self. Which I guess would be a good thing for reality. Definitely be a good thing for Spider-Man. Number 9, cheated. We find out about this one in Red Goblin, Red Death, and what's worse, it's a story that in the present day of that comic has a pretty gruesome ending. Here Norman runs into an old Empire University pal, if you could call him that. Ned Tobolowsky was someone Norman knew in school, and it's implied that at least they were friends, or at least acquaintances, before Ned spilled the beans about a cheating apparatus that Norman was using and had built. Ned's big mouth almost cost Norman his schooling. He lost his scholarship and was almost expelled, like these close. Honestly, if he created a cheating machine though, he probably should have been expelled in my opinion. Like, I don't know how they let him continue going to school after that. Norman gets Ned back though when Ned stops him on the street years later while he is Red Goblin. Not a good time. So true, what happens to Ned at least wasn't necessarily Green Goblin's doing, but I'm gonna count this anyways because 1, this thing happened way in his past, and 2, this list is more centered around Osborn as Goblin as opposed to like any specific Goblin identity. It's called Green Goblin, but I'm approaching it as like a Norman Osborn list. I know we've seen others wear that mantle as well, but I think Norman by far is one of the most dastardly goblins out there, red, green, or otherwise. Number 8, framed Spider-Man. If you think J. Jonah Jameson is bad, wait till you see what happens when Osborn takes over control of the Daily Bugle. At one point, Norman Osborn tries to use the paper himself to drag Spider-Man's name through the mud after buying it and then blackmailing Jameson into giving him full control over the paper and what gets published there. He then frames Spider-Man for murder, making it look like his webbing basically caused someone to die by asphyxiation, and puts a bounty on Spider-Man's head, starting off the Spider Hunt story arc. Of course, Peter finds a way out of all of this trouble and makes sure that Norman gets his in the end, but he still has to suffer through everyone hunting him down and believing that he was a killer, so still, it's pretty terrible. And before we move on to this next spot, just a quick reminder to give this video a thumbs up if you love Norman as much as we do. Love-hate. Number 7. Chameleon tried to manipulate her. A lot of people have tried to creep on Mary Jane. Even Peter's villains have tried to get in on that creeping action, in the worst way possible too. At one point, Chameleon attempted to convince Mary Jane to sleep with him by trying to trick her, coming in disguised as Peter Parker. Fortunately, we found out Mary Jane has a spidey sense of her own. Her version displayed here seems to imply that MJ can sense when Peter is actually the one kissing her, so this would be seemingly forgotten later on in continuity by other writers. She said kissing Chameleon made her skin crawl, and immediately she knew something was up. Although this is awful, it did give us a really awesome MJ moment as well, as Mary Jane threatens Chameleon afterward, completely prepared to fight and defend herself. Back off, Chameleon. Also love when Mary Jane gets badass moments like that where she's like, I'm feisty too, I can take ya. Number 6. Constantly being ditched for danger. This happens to Mary Jane more than once when she needs Peter. Honestly, she has to be one of the most understanding girlfriends and wives of the comic book world. Sure, it took her a while to take her and Peter's relationship seriously, but one thing she doesn't really do is judge Peter for wanting to be a hero. She might worry about his safety constantly and their family's safety, but she pretty much exclusively supports his need to be Spider-Man. And even when he doesn't necessarily have to go off to do the hero thing, she still supports him leaving her in times of need. The amount of times this comes up is far too often for me to count. Poor Mary Jane, she's just alone to worry most of the time. Number 5. Attacked by Harry Osborn. Mary Jane has been one of the targets of many different attacks over the years, where villains were attempting to get back at Spider-Man. But one attack also likely extended to include her, not just because she was attached to Spider-Man, but because she was no longer dating the culprit. Harry Osborn in issue 136 of the original Amazing Spider-Man series attempted to blow up both Peter Parker and Mary Jane when they came home and opened the door. Mary Jane at the time had decided to unlock the door for Peter as a fun, rebellious, feministic act, which is weird, but if you read the issue makes sense, pretending to be a female chauvinist. Fortunately, as the explosion was about to go off, Peter's spidey sense started alerting him of danger, and he managed to jump in between Mary Jane and the explosion. Still, she would later end up being kidnapped by Harry as well in the same arc, along with Aunt May and Flash Thompson. Number 4. Kidnapped by Jonathan Caesar. Yeah, that's right, Mary Jane gets kidnapped a lot, that's a thing. I just talked about her being kidnapped, and also on part 1 of this list we talked about Mary Jane being kidnapped by a mutant who wanted to become Peter Parker and take over his life. But this time around, she was kidnapped by a man who is obsessed with her herself and wanted to marry Mary Jane, even though she was already married. Apparently when you have enough money you can ignore that people are married, that's what's claimed here. Caesar kidnapped Mary Jane and hid her in an apartment in Bedford Towers, which he owned. The apartment was made especially for this purpose, showing off just how crazy the millionaire real estate mogul Jonathan really was. Caesar's plan was to marry MJ and live happily ever after with her, but she had other plans and she tried to escape. Surprise, surprise. Eventually, despite Jonathan threatening her with violence, she did manage to get away and get back to the arms of Spider-Man. Although we never really delve into what mark this left on Mary Jane emotionally, she just seems to kind of get over it all quite quick. Like Peter's like, can you go back home by yourself? And she's like, yeah, it's fine. I'd be like, no, don't leave me. This is terrifying. Number 3. Manipulated by Wolverine. This was just plain wrong all around. Because the ultimate reality is often known for taking things too far, it was in this reality that Wolverine tried to manipulate Mary Jane into sleeping with him just because he didn't like Spider-Man, and I guess because he also likes redheads, but also, what is happening? Spider-Man and Wolverine have a touchy relationship even in the 616 continuity. In fact, we've seen how mad Peter gets when Wolverine even mentions Mary Jane's name in a context that he doesn't like. Remember that time he punched him out of a window through what was supposed to be unbreakable glass? If Peter wasn't just a kid at at the time in the Ultimate reality, I'm sure he would have done much worse. Wolverine, while in Peter's body, attempted to put the moves on Mary Jane, who innocently did not know that someone else was in her boyfriend's body. That thing where people forget about, Mary Jane's spidey sense, like I was saying. This is all kind of gross for multiple reasons, one being consent, another being that Wolverine is an adult man and is also like hundreds of years old, and MJ is just a teenager here, and another being that this was all about getting back at Peter. Fortunately, MJ does not end up being pressured into sleeping with Wolverine while he's in Peter's body, but it is implied that at least something physical happened between these two. Number 2. Manipulated by Dr. Octopus. This one happened when Dr. Octopus was in fact in Peter Parker's body, which I think makes it worse than if Mary Jane had actually made out with Dr. Octopus in his actual body. At the time, of course, MJ thought that Otto was actually Peter, since he'd swapped bodies with Peter and was living his life as him. She noted that he was behaving differently, but dismissed these red flags because she was just so happy to be with Peter again. Mary Jane, knowing Peter for as long as she has, however, you would think would therefore know something was amiss even instinctively, but apparently writers disagreed or just really wanted to see this happen for some reason. Mary Jane, in fact, almost at one point takes things to the next level with Superior Spider-Man, but fortunately they get interrupted. Thank goodness. Number 1. Smashed into a wall. A lot of people like to refer to this one as the time when Peter hit Mary Jane, but this was actually much more than a hit. Mary Jane came up from behind to try and break up the fight between Ben Reilly, Peter's clone, and Peter Parker. Not seeing her, Peter swung back and didn't just hit her, he knocked her back so hard with his fist that she slammed back into the wall and seemingly broke part of the machinery behind her. Honestly, I'm surprised she didn't just die right there, because that seems like a lot. Spider-Man is much stronger than he looks, having the proportional strength of a spider. Even worse, she was pregnant at the time. Very pregnant. Although during her pregnancy, you might not have known it because from issue to issue, her belly seems to like swell and then flatten and then swell again. But that's comics for you. Number 10. Mind wiped. Well, in current continuity, this might not make as much sense given many people believe that Emma is in fact more powerful than Charles, and I've actually seen her kick his butt before. Regardless of your opinions on who would win in a telepathic battle, this happened before Emma was as developed when it came to her skill set. Professor X and Moira McTaggart came to visit Emma when she was working as a dancer at the Hellfire Club. Being Emma, she didn't have any shame in what she was doing and used her powers to get more money out of the gentlemen who came to the club to watch her dance. She tried to use this trick on Charles, who offered a different path for her, a place at his school. When Emma refused his offer, he ultimately decided to wipe her mind of their ever meeting. Whether this was for better or worse remains to be seen. Charles thought it was for the best, but I would argue having your mind wiped against your will is never really a good thing. Number 9. Was lied to. I mean, everyone was pretty much lied to about this, but you'd think at least Scott would share his plans with the woman that he loved. He didn't though, because he knew what Emma's answer would be, so rather than open up, he kept his mouth shut and kept it from her. What am I talking about? Cyclops and Wolverine's creation of the X-Force. While Emma is all for moral ambiguity, even X-Force for her and many others was seen as a general bad idea and taking things a little too far. The other thing, of course, was that neither she nor any of the other X-Men were even consulted on this decision, which of course made the whole revelation a lot worse. And before we move on to our number 8 spot, just a quick reminder to give that like a click if you haven't already. Seriously, if you click like, it makes your day better. It is statistically proven. Number 8. Choked by Medusa. I mean, this whole event was not necessarily great in my opinion for Emma or the X-Men or the Inhumans. Not a high moment overall. At the very least, just the outfit that Emma is wearing here is something else. Super protective shoulder pads and a giant belt buckle. It's definitely a statement. I'm just not sure it's a good one, especially when I'm used to Emma being such a fashionable character. That belt buckle is the thing that really bothers me in this outfit. Why is the belt buckle so big? It's like as big as her almost her entire midsection. Who made that belt? Is it made for giants? Anyways, it's fine. It just really bothers me when belt buckles are that big. What happened to Emma in Inhumans vs. X-Men that was really so terrible though, was how she ended up getting her butt kicked by Medusa, who used her hair powers to choke Emma. Emma was unable to use her telepathy while in her diamond form, and despite being in her diamond form, actually could have potentially been crushed by Medusa's hair if not for the intervention of Havoc, who saved her here. She was already beginning to break actually under the pressure when he showed up. Whew, that was a close one. You can see a piece of her fall. I don't know what piece that was, but hopefully nothing too valuable. Number 7, being named Pretender. What could be worse than being referred to as a traitor? Well, how about when Scarlet Witch was referred to as an imposter? This was the new label she was given after it was revealed that she was not actually a mutant, but had been led to believe that she was one for most of her life, due to the High Evolutionary disguising her and her twin brother as both mutants after experimenting on them, and apparently giving them powers himself. During the Dawn of X relaunch in an issue of X-Men, we actually see stories being told of Scarlet Witch where young mutants are taught to refer to her as a pretender, someone who posed as a mutant but was not one and could not be trusted. Seems a little unfair considering that Wanda herself did not know her true origin until much later in life. She wasn't lying, she had been manipulated into believing she was truly a mutant and Magneto's daughter. Number 6, death of her family. Even in the MCU, Wanda has a tragic origin story. In the cinematic universe, she and her brother Pietro were orphaned at a young age after they managed to survive an attack that collapsed their apartment. Their parents were killed in the explosion that decimated their home, but they survived after a second missile landed but did not explode. However, this experience would go on to haunt them for the rest of their days, with the name on the missile being burned into their memories for years to come. And that name, of course, was Stark, which is why when we first meet the Maximoff twins in Age of Ultron, they are enemies and not allies of the Avengers. Number 5, having Magneto for a father. At least for the time she did. While in the comics, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are no longer considered the children of Magneto, they still had him as a father for many years, and across many alternate Earths as well. While Magneto might be good with magnetizing, he is not very good at parenting. Magneto is usually a pretty strict father who has demanded much from his children over the years. I think Wanda, in terms of having a caring parent, was actually better off with her sentient cow mom that the High Evolutionary created. Number 4, spell backfire. Even when Wanda tries to do good, she can't catch a break. In the X-Men Empire series tie-in, Scarlet Witch seeks to right her wrongs by bringing back all those mutants lost in the massacre at Genosha. She is trying to atone for her past and all the harm that she has brought to mutant kind. But poor Wanda can't seem to catch a break. Her ritual to revive the dead backfires and instead simply turns those that she's trying to bring back into zombie mutants, instead of bringing them, fully back to life. To make matters worse, we later find out that Doctor Strange warned her against trying to make amends for her sins this way, telling her she couldn't do what had already been done. This made Wanda think that she simply needed to shift her focus instead of realizing that she needed to actually forge new paths as opposed to undoing old tragedies. Number 3, Vision's death. Going back to the MCU for a moment, one of the worst things that happened to Elizabeth Olsen's Scarlet Witch was the death of Ultron in Infinity War. Wanda had to kill her synthezoid lover herself after Thanos showed up to attack Wakanda during an attempted procedure to safely remove the Mind Stone from Vision, attempted by Black Panther's brilliant sister, the Princess Shuri. As the procedure was cut short and everyone was pulled into the fray, Thanos was on his way to claim that stone when Viz asked Wanda to destroy it, and by extension, destroy him. She initially refused, but reluctantly agreed when Viz pressed her and insisted that she wouldn't and couldn't hurt him with her powers, and that all he felt when she used them on him was her. No pain, just her. Aw, so cute. Through tears, Scarlet Witch used her powers to destroy the stone, only to watch Thanos show up and use the Time Stone to rewind time, bring Vision back to life, so that he could destroy him by ripping the Mind Stone out of his head very painfully. Yikes.